I'm going to tell you about the night of August 14th, 2019, and I'm going to tell it the way it happened, in the order it happened, because if I jump around or try to make it neater, I'll lose pieces of it, and I can't afford to lose any more pieces than I already have. Some of this story is already gone. The middle of that night has holes in it that I can't fill no matter how hard I try, and the parts I do remember, I remember in a way that doesn't feel like memory. It feels like something that was put there. So I'm going to start at the beginning, which is a Wednesday afternoon in August, and a cabin on a piece of property my dad bought in 1987 outside of Curtis, Michigan, in the eastern Upper Peninsula. And I'm going to go from there. The cabin sits on 22 acres about 9 miles southwest of Curtis, off a county road that turns into a 2-track that turns into nothing if you don't know where you're going. My dad bought the land cheap when the paper companies were selling off parcels in the late 80s, and he built the cabin himself over 3 summers with his brother. It's a small place. 1 main room with a wood stove, a kitchen area along the north wall, a loft for sleeping that you get to by a ladder, and a covered porch out front that looks south toward a clearing my dad kept mowed for deer. There's a well, a propane tank for the stove, a generator for when you really need power, and that's it. No internet, no cell service, no neighbors closer than about 3 miles in any direction. My dad died in 2014, and the property came to me. I'd been going up alone in summers since. That August I had taken 2 weeks off from my job. I was working at a heating and cooling company in Marquette, doing residential service calls, to do some work on the cabin. The roof needed new shingles on the south slope, the porch railing was rotting in 2 spots, and I wanted to clear some brush back from the tree line because the deer browse had moved off, and I figured opening the clearing up another 40 feet would bring them back. I drove up on Sunday the 11th. By Wednesday afternoon, I'd finished the shingles and was halfway through the porch railing. My buddy Rich Holloway was supposed to come up Friday and help me with the brush clearing, but Rich is a guy whose plans collapse about half the time, so I wasn't counting on him. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I grew up in the UP. I've been in the woods my whole life. I've hunted whitetails since I was 12. I've called in coyotes. I've crossed paths with black bears more times than I can count, including a sow with cubs, once that was way too close for either of our comfort. I know what wolves sound like. There's a pack that runs the area north of Newberry, and I've heard them on still nights from the cabin, the long, low howls that come in a chain, one starting before the last one ends. I know what those woods sound like at night. I know the regular cast of characters. None of that helped me with what came on Wednesday night. There's something else I want to put on the table before I get to it. My dad, when he was alive, was not a superstitious man. He was an engineer for the Road Commission in Schoolcraft County for 31 years. He calculated culvert sizes and gravel tonnage for a living. He balanced his checkbook to the penny every Sunday afternoon. He was the least woo-woo person you ever met. But there was one thing he wouldn't do at the cabin, and the one thing he wouldn't do was sleep with the loft window open, the gable window, the south-facing one. He'd open every other window on a hot night, run a box fan, do whatever he had to do to move air, but the loft window stayed closed and stayed latched. I asked him once when I was maybe 15 why he wouldn't crack it. We were sweating in the loft and the air was dead, and I was being a teenager about it. He said, "Bats." I said, "Dad, the screen would keep bats out." He said, "Bats and other things." And I remember laughing because he was being weird, and he did not laugh back. He looked at me like he wanted to say more and decided not to. And he latched the window, and we sweated through the night, and he never opened it. After he died, after I started going up alone, I opened the loft window once. The first summer. I was 28 years old, and I was the owner of the cabin, and I figured the rules were mine now. I slept maybe 2 hours. Not because anything happened. Nothing happened. I just couldn't sleep with it open. Every sound from the clearing came in, too clear, too close, and my body kept producing a low-grade adrenaline that wouldn't drop. Around 3 a.m., I got up and latched the window and slept fine. I haven't opened the loft window at night since. I'm telling you this because on Wednesday the 14th, the loft window was latched, the way my dad had always kept it. That detail mattered later. I'll come back to it. The day was warm, mid-80s, humid. The kind of August day in the UP where the deer flies are bad in the afternoon, and you spend half your time slapping the back of your neck. I knocked off work around 5, took a beer out to the porch, and watched the clearing. There was a doe with 2 fawns at the south edge, browsing along the tree line. The fawns were big, already losing their spots. I sat there for maybe 20 minutes watching them, and around 5:30 the doe lifted her head and froze. The fawns froze too. They were all looking northwest, into the woods on the far side of the clearing. I followed their line of sight and couldn't see anything. The doe stood there for a full minute, ears swiveling, body rigid. Then she turned and ran, just bolted. The fawns went after her. They cleared the clearing in maybe 4 seconds and disappeared into the trees on the east side. I sat with that for a minute. Deer don't run like that for nothing. They didn't blow, didn't snort, didn't bound away with their tails up the way they do when they catch a human scent. They ran flat out the way deer run from coyotes. I waited to see if anything came out of the tree line. Nothing did. I figured probably a coyote moving through, or maybe a bear, and the deer had picked it up on the wind. I finished my beer, went back inside, made a sandwich, and went to bed in the loft around 10. I want to walk through the cabin one more time so you can picture it. The main door faces south, onto the porch. There are 2 windows on the south wall, one on either side of the door. There's a window on the east wall above the kitchen counter. There's a window on the west wall above the wood box. The loft is open to the main room and has a single window in the south gable, facing the clearing. The walls are full log construction, 8 inches thick, which my dad and uncle peeled and notched themselves. The roof is standard rafters and decking, and now new shingles on the south slope. The doors and windows are good quality. My dad didn't cheap out on the openings because he said a cabin lives or dies by its closures. I remember him saying that. I fell asleep fast. I'd been working all day in the sun. I don't remember dreaming. The first thing I remember is waking up to the sound of the dogs in the clearing. I say dogs because that's what my brain put it in at the time. The clock on the shelf by the loft window read 1:04 a.m. The sound was a kind of yipping, high-pitched, 2 distinct voices, and at first I genuinely thought a couple of stray dogs had wandered onto the property. People up here let their dogs run loose more than they should, and I'd had a guy's bird dog show up on my porch once a few summers ago. All friendly, tags on the collar, owner 6 miles away. So my first thought, half asleep, was somebody's pups had come in from the road. I sat up in the loft and listened. The yipping went on for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped, then started again. There was something off about it that I couldn't put my finger on right away. The pitch was right for a young dog. The cadence wasn't quite. Real puppy yipping has a kind of randomness to it, this excited, scattered chirping. This had a back and forth structure. One would yip, pause, the other would yip back, pause, like a conversation, or like the way 2 kids will call to each other across a yard. I climbed down the ladder in my boxers and a t-shirt, grabbed my flashlight off the kitchen counter, and went to the south window. The clearing in front of the porch was washed in moonlight. There was about a 3/4 moon that night, and the sky was clear, and the clearing was lit up well enough that I didn't need the flashlight to see what was out there. There were 2 small shapes about 40 yards out, in the middle of the clearing, moving around each other. They looked like dogs. They moved like dogs. They were the size of, I'd say, a medium-sized dog at 6 months old, 40, 50 pounds maybe. Their coats looked dark in the moonlight, possibly brindle, possibly just shadowed. Here's the part where I should have stayed in the cabin. I want to be honest about this because I've replayed this moment 1,000 times. I should have stayed inside. I should have gone back up the ladder and gone to bed and let whatever was happening in the clearing happen. But what I did instead was open the front door and step out onto the porch. The reason I did that was simple. I thought they were lost dogs. I thought somebody's animals had wandered out of a yard, and I knew there was a creek about a half-mile west of my property, and the woods between here and there are thick, and if they were lost out here, they were going to die. I figured I'd see if they came to me, see if they had collars, see if I could keep them in the screened porch until morning, when I could drive them down to the nearest house. That's what I was thinking. That's the version of the thought that I can reconstruct. I stepped out onto the porch. The boards creaked under my bare feet. The 2 shapes in the clearing stopped moving immediately. Both of them turned and faced me, and I want to describe what I saw, because this is the first moment where my reading of the situation started to break down, and I want you to understand the specific way it broke down, because the specifics matter. The 2 animals in the clearing were sitting on their haunches. Sitting. Not standing on all fours, not lying down, sitting upright the way a dog sits when you tell it to sit. From 40 yards away, in moonlight, I could see the silhouettes pretty clearly. They had upright heads, upright torsos. Their front legs were on the ground in front of them, supporting their weight slightly, but they were sitting up. And the proportions were wrong. The torso was too long. The forelegs, or arms I guess, looked too long. The heads were too big. I stood there on the porch with my flashlight in my hand, and I didn't turn it on. I don't know why. Some instinct said don't, and I listened to it. I stood very still, and the two shapes in the clearing stayed very still, and I started running through the list of what they could be. Bear cubs was my first thought. Black bear cubs sit up like that sometimes, especially when they're nursing or playing. But the proportions were wrong for bear cubs. Bear cubs are roly-poly, round, short-limbed. These were lean. The forelimbs were long. Second thought, juvenile wolves. Wolves don't usually sit upright on their haunches the way dogs do, but pups will sometimes, and the size was about right for wolf pups maybe 4 or 5 months old. But the head shape was wrong. Wolf pups have a soft, almost domed head. These had a more angular shape, a longer muzzle. Third thought, and this is where my brain started to back away from what my eyes were doing, was that they weren't anything I could name. They weren't an animal I could put in a category, and while I was standing there trying to put them in a category, the smaller of the two made a sound. It made the yipping sound. Up close, from 40 yards instead of from the loft window, the sound was different. There was a quality to it I'd missed before. It wasn't just a yip. There was a kind of strain to it, like the throat producing it wasn't quite built for it. The way a person sounds when they try to imitate a baby, a vocal performance, not a vocalization. And the other one answered, and the back and forth started up again. But now, I was close enough to hear that it wasn't a conversation between two animals. It was the same sound, performed twice, as if one of them was teaching the other, or as if they were rehearsing something they'd heard. I'm going to stop and tell you what I started to feel at that moment, because this is something I've thought about a lot. It wasn't fear exactly, not yet. It was a kind of physical wrongness in my chest, like I'd taken a wrong turn into a part of the world that wasn't supposed to be open. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My stomach went cold. I had the strong sense that I was being watched not by the two animals in the clearing, but by something else. Something behind me, or above me, or somewhere out beyond the tree line. I started to back up toward the door, slowly. I didn't turn my back on them. The two shapes in the clearing watched me back up. They watched. They tracked me. Their heads turned together, slowly, following me to the door. I got my hand on the door handle, and that's when I heard it. The other one. From the tree line northwest of the cabin, where the deer had been looking earlier. A sound that I felt before I heard. Low. The way the bass at a concert goes through your ribs before your ears register it. It was a growl, or something like a growl, except it was sustained, and it was directional, and it came from something the size of which I could not let myself estimate while standing in my boxers on a porch in the middle of the woods at 1 a.m. I went inside, I shut the door, I locked it. The cabin door has a deadbolt and a chain. I did both. I stood with my back against the door, and my heart was hammering, and my hand was shaking so hard I had to grip the flashlight with both hands. The growl came again, louder, closer. I went to the south window and looked out. The two small ones were still sitting in the middle of the clearing. They hadn't moved. But now I could see at the northwest corner of the clearing, where the trees were thickest, where the deer had been staring before they ran, a shape. I couldn't see it well. The moonlight didn't reach into the tree line that deeply, but the shape was there. It was tall, it was standing, and it was watching the cabin. I want to be precise about how tall. I'm 6'2". I know what 6'2" looks like at 40 yards. This was bigger than that. The shape had a head that cleared the lower branches of a hemlock that I knew was about 7.5 feet up, because I'd walked past it that morning and almost banged my head on the underside of one of the limbs. So, whatever was standing there was over 7.5 feet tall, standing upright, bipedal. The growl stopped. The shape stepped back into the woods. I could see the branches move, a slow, heavy displacement, not the quick rustle of a deer slipping away, but the steady gait of something walking through brush that was no obstacle to it. And then I lost it. The clearing went quiet. The two small ones in the clearing stood up, on their hind legs. They stood up the way the big one was standing, not all the way upright, with a kind of hunched lean forward, but bipedal, and they walked. Not on all fours, on 2 legs with their forelimbs hanging at their sides. They walked across the clearing toward the cabin, toward the porch. I backed away from the window. I went to the kitchen and pulled the cabinet under the sink open and got the shotgun out from where I keep it in a soft case, behind the cleaning supplies. It's a Remington 870 pump, 12 gauge. I keep it loaded with 3-inch buckshot. I racked the action and pulled the case off and went back to the south window. The 2 small ones were on the porch. I'm going to slow down here, because this is the part that I have to tell carefully. They had come from the clearing in the time it had taken me to get the shotgun, maybe 20 seconds, maybe 30, and they had crossed 40 yards of open ground and climbed the porch steps. And they were on the porch in front of the door, in front of the south window I was now looking through. The window was at eye level for me, which means it was about head level for them, because standing upright they came up to about 5 feet, maybe 5'2", and they were standing there looking in. I want to describe their faces, and this is the part where my memory gets unreliable, because I think my brain refused to record some of what I was looking at. I remember the eyes. The eyes were not dog eyes, they were not wolf eyes, they were forward set, like a human's or an owl's, and they reflected the moonlight in a way that wasn't the green or yellow eye shine of a normal animal. They reflected with a kind of dull amber that didn't seem to come from the moonlight at all, but from somewhere inside. The muzzles were long, narrower than a dog's, and the mouths were slightly open. And inside the mouths, I could see teeth that were too many and too long and arranged in a way that didn't make sense for an animal that size. The ears were not on top of the head where a dog's would be. They were further back, more like a person's, but pointed, set against the skull. The fur was dark, dense, and there were patches around the face that looked almost bare. They were looking at me through the window. I leveled the shotgun at the window. I didn't fire. I want to be honest about why I didn't fire. Part of it was the simple fact that if I shot through the window glass and the buckshot went into one of them, and the other one, and the big one outside, heard the report, I had no idea what would happen next. And the worst-case version of what would happen next was bad enough that I wanted to delay it. But there was something else too. Something I have a harder time admitting. I didn't feel hatred from them. I didn't feel hunger. I felt curiosity. The way they were looking at me through the window was the way a kid at a zoo looks at an animal it's never seen before. Heads cocked, one of them slightly more than the other. Attentive, studying me. I raised one hand and waved at them, slowly, to see what they would do. They didn't react. They kept looking at me. Then the one on the right did something I will remember for the rest of my life. It raised one of its forelimbs and pressed the pad of what would be its palm against the glass. The way a person presses their hand against a window to see if the surface is cold, and it held it there, and it tilted its head, slowly, like it was listening for something, and it pulled its hand back and looked at its palm, and then it looked at me again. The growl came back from the tree line, lower, closer. Both of the small ones at the window turned their heads toward the sound. They held still for a few seconds. Then they backed off the porch, not turning around, walking backwards down the steps, keeping their eyes on the cabin until they were back in the clearing. And then they did turn, and they trotted across the clearing toward the northwest tree line, and they were gone. I stood at the window with the shotgun and waited. The forest went quiet in a way I have never heard a forest go quiet before. There were no insects. In August, in the UP, at 1 a.m, there should have been crickets, tree frogs, a constant layer of sound. There was nothing. The silence had a pressure to it, like deep water. I checked the clock. It was 1:19 a.m. The whole thing, from the time I'd woken up to the time the small ones disappeared into the tree line, had taken 15 minutes. It felt like an hour. I went around the cabin and checked every window. East window, kitchen, nothing. West window, wood box, nothing. South windows, clearing, empty. I went up the ladder to the loft, slowly, with the shotgun ahead of me, and looked out the gable window. The clearing was empty in the moonlight. The tree lines were dark. I sat on the edge of the loft bed with the shotgun across my knees and tried to think. The thinking did not go well. Part of me wanted to get in my truck and drive. The truck was parked maybe 30 feet from the porch, off to the east side. I had the keys hanging on a hook by the door. If I went out fast, I could be in the truck in 10 seconds, and the truck could be moving in 15, and I could be on the county road in 3 minutes, and on the highway in 20. That was one option. The other option was to stay. The cabin was solid, log walls 8 inches thick, good doors, good windows, but the windows were the weak point, and I knew it. 8 inches of pine versus whatever was out there in the tree line. I didn't know what odds to give it. I was still working through this when I heard the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, spaced too far apart to be a person walking, the gait of something with a stride longer than mine. They came from the west side of the cabin. They moved along the wall, outside, on the ground. The wall is 8 inches of solid timber, and I could still hear the steps clearly through it. Each one shook the floor slightly, not a hard shake, a faint settling, the way the floor moves when a heavy truck goes by on a county road 100 feet away. The steps went the length of the west wall, paused at the southwest corner, and then continued along the south wall, past the front porch. I could hear them on the gravel of the path that runs along the front of the cabin. I tracked the sound as it moved past the porch. Then it reached the southeast corner and turned and went along the east wall and around to the north wall and around to the west wall again and around. It circled the cabin, twice, slowly. The whole circuit took maybe 4 minutes, which is a long time when you're sitting in the dark, listening to something walk around a building you're inside of. On the second pass, it stopped on the south side, in front of the porch. I could hear it breathing, through the wall. The breathing was slow and deep, and there was a faint rattle to it on the inhale, the way a horse's breath rattles when it's been running. Except, this wasn't running. This was at rest. The volume of air moving in and out was the volume of something with a chest the size of a refrigerator. I went to the south window, very slowly, and I looked. It was standing at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at the door. I couldn't see all of it from the angle I had. The window frame cut off the top of its head, but I could see the chest and the shoulders and the upper arms, and the arms were too long, and the shoulders were too broad, and the chest was massive and slowly rising and falling with the breathing I'd been hearing through the wall. The fur was dark, almost black, and matted in places. There were lighter patches on the chest, gray or silver. The hands, and I have to call them hands because that's what they were, hung at the ends of the arms and had fingers, long fingers with thick claws at the tips, and the hands looked too large for the arms, the way a child draws a hand when they don't know how to draw a hand. I stepped back from the window and moved to the side, slowly, so I could see the head. The head came into view at the top of the frame. It was huge. The muzzle was long, easily 1.5 feet from the base of the skull to the nose, and it was angled downward, toward the door, the way a dog will angle its head when it's tracking a scent. The ears were laid back. The eyes, when I caught the edge of them in the moonlight, reflected the same dull amber the small one's eyes had reflected. But where the small ones had felt curious, this one did not feel curious. This one felt like it was deciding something. I was 12 feet from the door. The shotgun was in my hands. If it came up the porch, if it touched the door, I was going to fire through the door, through the wood, 3 rounds of buckshot center mass at point-blank range. I had myself talked into it. My hands had stopped shaking. There's a thing that happens when you're past a certain threshold of fear, where the shaking stops and you go cold and steady. And I was there. It didn't come up the porch. It stood at the bottom of the steps for, I don't know how long, a minute, 2 minutes. Then it turned its head, slowly, and looked north, toward the tree line where I'd first seen it, and it let out a sound. This wasn't a growl. This was a vocalization. 2 notes, a low one and a higher one, with a click between them, like a word, like a syllable with a glottal stop in the middle of it. Brief, quiet even, considering the size of the chest producing it. The kind of sound you'd make to call to someone without raising your voice. From the tree line, 2 answering sounds, the same pattern, higher pitch, the pups. They were still out there. They were waiting. The big one stepped back from the porch steps, turned, and walked off toward the northwest tree line. Each step shook the floor. I watched it cross the clearing. In the moonlight, with the size of it out in the open, I could see it fully for the first time, 7.5 feet. Maybe more, bipedal. The gait was wrong. The legs bent the wrong way at the knee, or seemed to, with the kind of digitigrade structure a dog has walking on its toes, except scaled up to support a body the size of a refrigerator on its hind legs. The arms swung slightly with the walking, like a person's arms, but their length put the hands down past, where its knees would be on a human. It moved with a strange smoothness, no bounce, no sway, as if every muscle had been calibrated by something that had practiced walking like this for a long time. It reached the tree line. The branches parted. It stepped into the dark. The 2 small ones came out from where they had been waiting and joined it. And then the 3 of them stood there, at the edge of the tree line, watching the cabin. I'm going to pause here for now, because the rest of the night was longer and stranger than what I've told you so far. and I want to make sure I have my head clear before I get into it. What I've told you so far, the porch, the window, the circuit around the cabin, the call and answer between the big one and the pups, that part I can recount cleanly. The rest is harder. The rest is where the holes are. I'm going to pour myself some coffee, even though it's the wrong time of day for it, and then I'm going to come back and finish. Okay. So, I'm back. I'm picking up where I left off, which is about 1:35 a.m. on the night of August 14th, 2019, with three shapes standing at the northwest tree line of the clearing in front of my cabin in the eastern Upper Peninsula of Michigan. The big one and the two smaller ones, watching the cabin. Watching me, presumably, though I couldn't see their eyes from that distance, only the rough outlines of them against the dark wall of the forest. They stood there for a long time. I want to give you an exact figure, but my sense of time during what came next is unreliable. I'd say 20 minutes, maybe 30. I watched them from the south window with the shotgun in my hands, and I didn't move, and they didn't move. I was waiting for them to leave, or charge, or do something. They were waiting for something too, and I didn't know what. While I was watching, I started running through options. The truck was still my best bet, but the truck was parked on the east side of the cabin, and to get to it, I had to go out the front door, down the porch steps, and across about 30 feet of open ground. The three of them were at the northwest corner of the clearing, which meant they were maybe 60 yards from the truck. If they were the speed of a normal dog, 60 yards was a 4-second sprint. I could not get from the porch to the truck and into the truck and have the engine started in less than 4 seconds. Not even close. The truck was off the table. The radio. I had a handheld VHF up at the cabin, the kind hunters use, with a range of maybe 5 miles in good conditions and less in the woods. I'd never used it for an emergency. I'd kept it for years because my dad had always kept one. I went to the shelf by the door where it sat, picked it up, and turned it on. The battery was at about a third. I scanned the frequencies. Nothing, no traffic. It was Wednesday at 1:35 in the morning in mid-August. There was nobody on the channels. I tried Channel 16, the Marine Emergency Channel, even though I knew I was nowhere near a Great Lake. Nothing. I tried Channel 9, the call channel that some hunters monitor. Nothing. I keyed up and put out a call just in case. Anyone receiving, this is a cabin 9 miles southwest of Curtis, requesting any assistance. I let go of the key. Static. I repeated it. Nothing. I tried for maybe 2 minutes. Nothing came back. I set the radio down. I went back to the south window. The three of them were still standing at the tree line. Around Tuesday a.m., something changed. The big one moved. It took a step forward, out of the tree line, into the clearing. Just one step. The two smaller ones followed, one step. They stood there. The big one tilted its head, the way a dog does when it hears a sound it's trying to place. Then, it took another step. They were coming. I went to the wood box on the west wall and started moving wood. The wood box is built against the wall, and the wall behind it is the most solid section of the cabin, full logs without any window penetrations. I started stacking wood from the box against the south wall, against the windows, 3 layers deep. It was a stupid idea, in retrospect. Buying time, mostly. Giving myself something to do with my hands. I worked for maybe 2 minutes, stacking and bracing the wood against the inside of the windows, until I couldn't see out the south window anymore. Then I went around and did the east window. The west window I left alone, because I could see the wood box from where I was, and could keep an eye on it. The loft gable window I couldn't reach to block without going up the ladder, and I didn't want to be in the loft with limited mobility. I went back to where the south window had been, behind the wood, and put my ear to the wall and listened. The footsteps were coming. Slow, deliberate. The big one. I could hear it crossing the clearing. I tracked the gait. 5 seconds between each footfall. Slow, not a stalk, a walk. It was walking up to the cabin like it had all the time in the world. I want to tell you something that I haven't told anyone, including the friends I've shared parts of this story with, because I'm telling this once and I'm telling it whole. While I was standing there with my ear against the wall, listening to the footsteps come closer, I had a thought. The thought was, it doesn't want to hurt me. The thought arrived complete, like a sentence handed to me by somebody else. It doesn't want to hurt me. I felt the thought. I didn't reason my way to it. And I want to be careful here, because looking back, I'm not sure whether the thought was mine, or whether it was, I don't know how to say it, suggested. Whether it came from somewhere outside my head. Because here's the thing. When I went and looked out the west window, the one I'd left clear, I could see across the side of the cabin and out into the clearing partway, and what I saw was that the big one had stopped, about 15 feet from the porch, not at the steps, off to the side. And it was looking up. It was looking at the chimney. The cabin has a stone chimney that goes up the south wall, exterior, with the wood stovepipe coming through the wall and tying in. The chimney's about 20 feet tall. The big one was looking at the top of the chimney, head tilted back, and then it lowered its head and looked at me through the west window. I want to repeat that. It looked at me through the west window, even though the west window was the one I hadn't blocked, and even though it was standing on the south side of the cabin, it had angled its body and head to make sight contact with me through the one window I'd left. It knew. I dropped below the windowsill. I crawled on my hands and knees with the shotgun in my left hand to the center of the cabin, away from all the walls. I sat there on the floor, in the middle of the room, breathing as quietly as I could. The footsteps started again. The big one was moving. It was coming around to the west side of the cabin, the side with the only window I hadn't blocked. I heard it cross the gravel path and stop next to the west wall. I heard its breathing through the wall, slow and deep. Maybe 4 feet from where I was sitting on the floor, separated by 8 inches of pine. Then I heard a sound I cannot fully account for. A click or a tap against the glass, like a fingernail on a window pane, light, tentative. The way a person taps a window to get the attention of someone inside without startling them. Then again, tap, then a third time, tap. I sat on the floor and looked up at the west window. I could see the top of the head silhouetted against the moonlight outside, the ears, the long muzzle in profile. It was looking in at the cabin, scanning, trying to find me. I had moved away from the window. I was below its sight line. The tapping stopped. I heard it move away from the window, around to the north wall, along the back of the cabin. The footsteps moved at the same slow, deliberate pace. It walked the entire perimeter of the cabin, again, the way it had earlier. But this time, at each window, it stopped, and there was a tap. South window, blocked, but I heard a tap on the glass behind the wood. East window, blocked, tap. West window, tap. Back to the north wall, where there are no windows, and the footsteps continued without stopping. Then it came back to the front of the cabin and stopped at the door. And it tapped on the door. 3 taps, light. The same cadence as the taps on the windows. Then a pause, then 3 more taps. I was still on the floor. The shotgun was across my knees. I had my finger off the trigger on the side of the receiver, like my dad taught me. I was not going to fire unless something came through the door. It tapped a third time, 3 taps, and then it left. The footsteps moved away from the door, down the porch steps, across the gravel, into the clearing. I heard them fade as it walked back toward the northwest tree line. I waited a long time, with my back against the kitchen counter and my eyes on the door, before I crawled to the west window and looked out. The big one was back at the tree line, with the 2 smaller ones. All 3 of them were facing the cabin, standing. It was 2:31 a.m. I checked the clock. I'm going to try to describe the rest of the night honestly, but this is where I lose pieces. I had been awake for an hour and a half by this point, in a state of physical fear that had drained me. I was cold even though the cabin was warm. My legs were cramping from the position I'd been sitting in. And the thing I remember most clearly, more clearly than any sensory detail, is the sense that I was being looked at. The 3 of them at the tree line weren't doing anything, but the looking was continuous. It pressed against the cabin like weather. Around 3 a.m., I think it was 3 a.m., though I cannot swear to it, I went up to the loft. I needed elevation. I needed to see the whole clearing. I climbed the ladder with the shotgun in my left hand and the radio in my right pocket, and I went to the gable window and looked out. There were 5 of them now. The 3 at the northwest tree line were still there. 2 more had appeared at the southeast corner of the clearing. Adults, both of them, smaller than the big one, but full-sized, larger than the pups. They had come without me hearing them. They were standing at the southeast tree line, watching the cabin. The cabin was now surrounded on 2 corners, northwest and southeast. The southwest and northeast quadrants of the clearing were empty. But I understood, looking at the placement, that the empty quadrants were not actually empty. They were watched. Anything moving across the clearing would be visible to one of the 2 groups, and if it tried to flee in either direction, it would be running toward whichever group was on that side. It was a kill box. They'd set up a kill box around my cabin, and the timing of it, the second pair arriving while the big one had distracted me by walking the perimeter and tapping on the windows, was not the kind of timing animals do. Animals do not coordinate that way. I'm a hunter. I've watched canids work prey. They run drives, sure, dogs and wolves both. But this was different. This had been a plan executed in stages. Sitting in the loft, with the shotgun across my knees, I started to do something I'd been putting off doing for the last hour, which was think clearly about what I was looking at. Because the longer I sat with what was outside, the harder it got to apply any of the frameworks I'd grown up with. I'd been telling myself dogs for an hour and wolves for a half hour, and the words were not fitting. The bipedal stance was not a wolf stance. The shoulder structure was not a wolf shoulder structure. The forelimbs were not wolf forelimbs. The proportions of the head, big skull, long muzzle, ears set back rather than top of skull, were not wolf. They were not anything I had a word for. There was a word in my head, a word I'd heard a few times from older guys in Newberry and Curtis, who'd had their own stories, a word I had always dismissed because it was a word that belonged to YouTube videos and podcasts and tabloid websites and not to real life. I'm not going to use the word here because I don't want to use it. I want to describe what was there, not classify it. What was there was something that had a body plan a person could draw if they were told to draw a wolf-headed man. But it wasn't a man and it wasn't a wolf. The head was too lupine to be a man, the body was too upright to be a wolf, and the size of it was wrong for both, and it wasn't alone. There were at least 5 of them on my property at 3 in the morning, and they had set up a structured perimeter, and they had a way of communicating with each other that involved vocalizations with two-tone patterns and clicks, and the largest one had specifically and deliberately knocked on my door. I keep coming back to the knocking because the knocking is the part that I cannot fit anywhere. A predator does not knock. A predator that wants to get into a building scratches, digs, throws its weight against doors. The knocking was something else. The knocking was social. The knocking was, and I don't have a better word for this, polite. While I was thinking about this, the radio in my pocket crackled. A burst of static. Then nothing. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. The frequency hadn't changed. The squelch was set the same as before. Nothing was transmitting. I held it up to my ear. Silence. Then another burst of static. Then a sound that I couldn't tell whether it was coming from the radio or from outside. A long, low note. Sustained. The kind of sound that a tuba makes at the bottom of its range, except it didn't have the brassy quality. It was rougher, more vocal. The big one was vocalizing from the northwest tree line. I could hear it through the radio and through the wall. The radio was picking up something, not on a normal frequency. The radio shouldn't have been picking up anything that wasn't on the channel I had it set to, but the sustained note was coming through the speaker, distorted, as if the radio was straining to render something that wasn't designed for radio. The note went on for, I'd guess, 15 seconds, and then it stopped, and the radio went silent. And from the southeast tree line, an answering note, the same pitch, the same duration. And then the radio crackled again, and the answer came through the speaker too, on a delay of maybe a half second behind the actual sound. I turned the radio off. I sat in the loft and watched the clearing. The 5 of them stood at their corners. Nothing moved. The minutes went by. I checked the clock at 3:30. I checked it at 4. Around 4:15, the eastern sky started to get the first faint gray of pre-dawn, and I felt something loosen in my chest, because I knew that the UP in August has a sunrise around 6:30 a.m., and pre-dawn light starts to come up around 5 all. And if I could hold for another hour, the light might change whatever was happening. I want to tell you about what happened between 4:30 and 5:30, which is the worst part, and the part I have the least access to. I know that I went down the ladder at some point during this stretch, because I remember being on the ground floor by the wood stove. I don't know why I went down. I don't know what I did down there. There's a kitchen drawer that was open in the morning that I don't remember opening. There's a chair that was moved from the table to the front of the door that I don't remember moving. I don't have explanations for these things. I can tell you what I remember. I remember sitting on the floor with my back against the wood stove. The stove wasn't lit. The metal of the stove was cool against my back. I remember the radio being in my hand, off. I remember the shotgun being across my knees. I remember thinking with great clarity, they want me to come outside. The thought again, like the first one earlier, arrived complete. They want me to come outside. And the next thought was, I should go outside. and the thought after that was something like, I should open the door and step out onto the porch and see what they want. I want to be careful about how I describe this because I'm not asking you to believe a particular interpretation. I'm telling you that I had these thoughts. The thoughts had a texture that I don't have language for. They felt like my thoughts, in that they were in my voice, in my head. But they also felt like they were being placed there. The way an idea can sit in your head that you know didn't originate with you, that you picked up from a conversation or a book, and it's just lodged there. Except I hadn't read any book or had any conversation that would have given me the idea that I should open my door at 4-something in the morning and step out onto the porch toward 5 wolf-headed things that had set up a perimeter around my cabin. I sat with the thought. I knew, in a clear and stable way, that I was not going to open the door. But the thought kept coming back. They want you to come outside. Come outside. Just open the door. Just look. Just see what they want. At some point during this, I think I started crying. I don't usually cry. I was crying. Not from fear exactly, from a kind of exhaustion, from the effort of holding myself in the cabin against the pressure of those thoughts. I started reciting things. I needed something to say in my head that wasn't the come outside thoughts. I recited the names of the streets in the neighborhood I'd grown up in: Maplewood, Cedar, Birch, Hemlock, Larch. I recited the order of the bones in the hand: carpals first, scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, pisiform, trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, hamate, 8 of them. My dad had been a hand surgeon's assistant for 6 years before he moved up north, and he drilled them into me when I was a kid. I recited the multiplication tables. I recited every state capital I could remember. I went through the alphabet and named an animal for each letter: anteater, badger, coyote, donkey, elephant. The recitation gave my mind something to push against. The come-outside thoughts kept coming, but they came in between the recitations, and the recitations were mine, and as long as I kept reciting, I was the one talking in my head. The thoughts were not violent. That's something I want to mention, because I think it would have been easier if they had been. If the thoughts had been, go outside so I can hurt you, I could have refused them cleanly. But the come-outside thoughts had a warmth to them, a welcoming quality. The thought of going outside felt the way the thought of going home feels when you've been away too long. It felt like the cabin was the strange place, and the clearing was where I belonged. The thoughts said things like, "It's all right, you can see now. You can finally see." They said, "They've been waiting a long time. They've been so patient." They said, "Come on, don't make them wait anymore." There was a specific one that came back maybe 4 or 5 times during that stretch. The thought was, "Your father would have come outside." I want to sit with this one for a second, because it's the thought I've turned over the most in the years since. My father never said anything to me about creatures in the woods. My father was the man who wouldn't open the loft window. My father, by every objective measure of his life, would not have come outside. He had built the cabin specifically so he could be inside walls at night. He had spent 31 years calculating tolerances. He was not a man who went out to see what was knocking, but the thought, when it came, had a certainty to it that I couldn't shake at the time. Your father would have come outside. He would have known what to do. He would have been brave. You should be more like him. Come outside. He would have come outside. It took me weeks afterward to identify what was wrong with this thought. The wrong thing was that the version of my father in the thought was not my father. It was a constructed version, a version that flattered me into thinking that, to honor him, I had to do the thing I most didn't want to do. My actual father would have grabbed the shotgun, locked every door, and sat in the middle of the floor with his back to a wall. I know this because that's what he had me do once, during a tornado warning when I was 9 years old. He didn't go look at the sky. He went to the basement, he took the dog, he waited for the all clear. He came up. The version of him in the come outside thought was a fictional father, designed by something that did not know my actual father, designed to get me to walk out a door. That fictional father is the cleanest evidence I have that the thoughts were being suggested from outside me, because nothing in my own head would have written that line. My own head knew my father better than that. Whatever was generating the thoughts was working off a template, a generic, a guess about how a son in his 30s responds to a guilt-tripping invocation of a dead father. The guess was clever enough to fool me for the first few iterations. By the 4th or 5th pass, I'd started to notice the seam. By the time the gray light came up, I had identified the seam as a seam and stopped responding to it. I think that may have been the moment when I held the wall. I don't know. I'm doing forensics on a moment I barely survived. I noticed something else during that stretch that I want to mention because I haven't been able to make sense of it since. There was a smell, faint but present, inside the cabin. It hadn't been there before. It came on slowly, the way a smell comes on when you've been in a room and you don't notice the smell anymore until you leave and come back. Except, I hadn't left. The smell came to me. It was an animal smell, but it wasn't bad. It wasn't a wet dog smell or a kennel smell. It was the kind of smell you get from a horse's neck on a cold morning, warm and musky and slightly sweet, with a base note of pine sap and something mineral, like wet stone. I tried to figure out how the smell was getting into the cabin. The doors were sealed, the windows were closed, the damper on the wood stove was shut. The smell had no path I could identify, but it was there, and the more I noticed it, the more I felt the come-outside thoughts. And the more I felt the come-outside thoughts, the more I noticed the smell. I held my breath at one point to see if the smell came from my own clothes or my own skin. I held it for as long as I could. When I exhaled, the smell was still there. When I cupped my hand over my mouth and nose and breathed into my hand, my breath smelled like coffee and adrenaline and the chapstick I'd put on hours earlier. My breath didn't smell like the smell. The smell was in the cabin. The smell was being introduced. I don't know how. I don't remember the come-outside thoughts ever stopping. I remember the recitation and the first gray light through the west window and the sound of a single bird in the woods, a robin, which is the kind of small thing you hear at first light and which felt, when I heard it, like a hand reaching down into a hole and pulling me out. The clock read 5:42 a.m. I stood up. My legs almost gave out. I had to brace against the wall. I went to the west window and looked out. The clearing was gray with pre-dawn light. The tree lines were still dark. I couldn't see anything in the northwest corner. I couldn't see anything in the southeast corner. The clearing was empty. I went back to the south windows and pulled the wood off and looked out. The clearing was empty. I went to the east window and pulled the wood off. The clearing was empty. I went to the door and stood with my hand on the deadbolt and listened. There were birds. There were 2 birds at first, then 4, then a steady chorus. The forest had come back. The insects were back. A mosquito landed on the back of my hand, and I let it bite me because it felt like the world had restarted. I waited until 6:30 a.m. when the sun came up properly over the ridge to the east, and I opened the door. I had the shotgun. I stepped out onto the porch. The porch boards were marked. There were prints on them. I want to describe these because I went back later in the day with a camera and took photographs. They are not perfect dog prints. They are not perfect wolf prints. They are large, 3 to 4 inches across, with 5 toe pads instead of the 4 that canids have. And the toe pad placement is wrong for a canid. More spread, more like a hand than a paw. The claw marks at the tips of the toes are heavier than a dog's claws would leave. And there's a depth to the impressions, especially the heel pad, that suggests a weight much greater than any dog. I am 6'2", and I weigh 210 pounds. I stood next to one of the prints and pressed my own bare foot down on the wood, and the impression I left was lighter than the print already there. I weighed more than the print, and the print was deeper. The door had marks too. 3 marks on the door, at about the height the big one's head would have been if it had been standing on the porch in front of the door. They weren't scratches, they weren't gouges. They were 3 small indentations about an inch apart, like something hard but not sharp had been pressed into the wood. The way a fingernail will leave a mark in a softer wood like pine. They were arranged in a line, 3 taps, 3 marks. I walked across the clearing to the northwest tree line. I had the shotgun. I went slow. I expected to find tracks at the edge of the trees. I expected to find the place where the 3 of them had stood. I did not find that. I found nothing. I found grass and moss and pine needles, all undisturbed. No prints, no broken twigs, no tufts of fur, no scat. Nothing. 5 animals had stood at that tree line for hours, and they had left no physical trace. I went to the southeast corner. Same thing. 2 animals had stood there for hours. There was no sign of any animal having been there. The ground was undisturbed. I came back to the cabin. The prints on the porch were still there. I photographed them. I photographed the marks on the door. I went inside and packed my things and got in the truck and drove to Curtis. And from Curtis, I drove to my buddy Rich's house in Marquette. where his wife let me sleep on their couch for 2 days. I told Rich I'd had a rough night and didn't want to be alone. I didn't tell him the rest until later, and even then I told him a shortened version because I didn't want to say the whole thing out loud. The whole thing is what I'm telling you now, for the first time, the way it actually happened. I went back to the cabin 2 weeks later, in daytime, with Rich, to finish the work I'd started. We reshingled the porch, we finished the railing, we did the brush clearing. Nothing came at night. Nothing has come at night since. I have been back to the cabin probably 20 times in the years since August 2019, and I have heard wolves in the distance a few times, and I have seen black bears on the property twice, and I have not seen any sign of the things from that night. The prints on the porch faded over the winter under snow and weather. The marks on the door, the 3 little indentations, are still there. I rub my thumb over them sometimes when I'm coming or going. They're a few millimeters deep. They haven't filled in. I want to be honest about a few things before I finish. I don't know what they were. I've thought about it a lot. The word that gets used for things like this, the word the older guys in Newberry use, I'm not going to use, because using it puts the whole story in a category that has been used for entertainment purposes by people who weren't there, and I don't want to be in that category. I will tell you what I observed, and you can put what name you want on it. 5 bipedal canid-headed animals, 2 adults of substantial size, one of which was over 7 feet tall, 2 smaller individuals that I will call juveniles, 1 other adult of moderate size. They coordinated. They communicated vocally with 2-tone calls. They could move silently when they wanted to, and could move heavily when they wanted to, and the heaviness was a choice. The big one, in particular, was performing for me. The circuit around the cabin, the tapping at every window, the deliberate slowness of the gait, all of it was a display. Not a threat display, something else. I don't have the word for what kind of display it was. I don't know what they wanted. The come-outside thoughts I had during the worst stretch of that night, between 4:30 and 5:30, I cannot account for. I am not somebody who has had unusual experiences with my own head before. I have never had auditory or visual hallucinations. I have never had intrusive thoughts that I couldn't trace back to a cause. The come-outside thoughts felt different from any thought I've ever had before or since. They felt like signal. Whether the signal came from outside the cabin or from inside my own brain reacting to extreme stress, I can't say. I can tell you what it felt like. I don't know why they left. The sun was coming up. Maybe they don't like daylight. Maybe they had other things to do. Maybe whatever they wanted from me, they decided they weren't going to get. The leaving was as orderly as the arrival. They stood their positions until the gray light started, and then they were gone. And the empty corners of the clearing were as empty as they would have been on any other August morning in any other year of my life. A few things I want to say, in closing. I have not gone to any law enforcement or wildlife agency with this story. I have thought about it. The DNR has a wildlife hotline. The county sheriff has a non-emergency line. But what would I tell them? I have prints on the porch that are big and have 5 toes. I have 3 marks on a door. I have no other physical evidence. I have a story that, if I told it to a DNR officer or a sheriff's deputy, would do nothing for me except get my name into a file somewhere as the guy who saw things at his cabin. The professionals I might tell are not going to come out and survey the property because there is nothing to survey. The 5-toed prints could be made up. I could have pressed them into the porch boards with a stick. The marks on the door could be from anything. The story has nothing to support it but the story itself. I have, however, talked to a few of the older guys in Curtis and Newberry, carefully, indirectly. I went to the bar at the Cedar Tap in Newberry one night, about 6 months after, and got into a conversation with a guy named Wes Loonsfoot, who used to work for the DNR before he retired. We were talking about wolves at first, and I steered the conversation, and at one point I said, "Have you ever heard any of the older guys talk about something bigger than a wolf that walks upright?" And Wes looked at me for a long time, and he didn't smile, and he didn't laugh, and he said, "Where are you?" And I told him my property. And he nodded slowly and took a drink of his beer and said, "There's a few places up here. Old places. Be careful." I asked him what he meant by old. He thought about it. He said, "Places that were here before us. Places where the things that were there first didn't leave when we showed up. They just stay back. Most of the time. Sometimes one of them comes out for a look. And then he changed the subject, and we talked about something else, and I never brought it up with him again. He died of a stroke 2 years later. I went to his funeral. His wife thanked me for coming and didn't ask how I'd known Wes. I think a lot of people knew Wes and didn't know him well, and I was just one of them. I asked one other person, a guy named Pete Kurjala, who runs a hardware store in Engadine and who I've known since I was a teenager because my dad used to buy his nails and screws from Pete's father. Pete is about 70 now. I went in one afternoon to pick up some chimney brushes for the wood stove, and I was standing at the counter while he rang me up, and I said, "Pete, can I ask you a weird question?" And he said, "Sure." And I said, "Did your dad ever talk about anything strange in the woods south of Curtis?" Just like that. Open. I figured Pete would tell me whether I was being foolish. Pete went quiet for a minute and finished ringing me up. He gave me my change. Then he leaned on the counter and said, "My dad never talked about much, but there was one summer, must have been 63 or 64, where he wouldn't take any deliveries out toward Curtis. He'd send my uncle. I asked him once why, and he said the road went somewhere he didn't want to be. He never explained more than that." Pete looked at me. "Did something happen to you out there?" I said something had. I didn't elaborate. Pete nodded like I'd confirmed a thing he'd been suspecting his whole life. He said, "My dad's brother, my Uncle Henry, he saw something one time he wouldn't talk about. He carried it for 40 years, and he told me when he was dying. He made me promise I wouldn't tell anyone while he was alive. He died in 2009. I still haven't told anyone the whole of it." He stopped there. He didn't tell me, and I didn't push. What I want you to take from that, what I took from it, is that there are people up here who know. They don't talk about it, because what would be the point? They don't write it down. They don't go on podcasts. They carry it for 40 years, and then they tell one person on their deathbed, and they make that person promise. There is a whole quiet population of people in the eastern UP who have stories like mine, and most of them will go to their graves with their stories, and the country will keep doing what it does. I think a lot now about how much of what I experienced was being managed. The pacing of that night. The way the big one came up to the porch but didn't try to come through the door. The way the small ones approached but didn't attack. The way the perimeter was set up but never closed. The way the come-outside thoughts came on slowly, gently, with warmth, rather than the way fear comes on. Everything about that night was being run on a low setting. If I had been hunted, I would not have lasted 20 minutes. They were not hunting. They were doing something else, and the something else required me to be inside the cabin, alive, conscious, and exposed to them for a long time. I was the subject of something. I don't know what the something was. I have my guesses. I'm not going to share them because the guesses are worse than the not knowing. I want to say one more thing, and then I'm done. When I think about that night now, 6.5 years later, I don't think about the fear. The fear was real, and the fear was big, and the fear is what I lived with for months afterward, but the fear has faded. What I think about now is the big one looking at me through the west window, the angle of its head, the way it had positioned itself to make sure I was looking at it, the deliberate eye contact, the tapping at the door, 3 taps, 3 taps, the look on the face of the small one that pressed its hand against the south window, the tilt of its head. I don't think they meant to scare me. I think the scaring was a side effect. I think they were trying to do something else. I think they were trying to be noticed by me without doing the thing that would have ended the noticing right away, which is killing me. I think the perimeter was not a kill box. I think it was an audience. I think I was the show. And I think the show was over when I didn't come outside. I think they had been hoping I would come outside. I think about Wes Loonsfoot saying, "Sometimes one of them comes out for a look." And I think about how that night, 5 of them came out for a look, and the look was at me, and the look went on for 4 hours. And I think about how the come-outside thoughts felt like an invitation, and what it would have meant to accept it. I never accepted the invitation. I stayed inside, I held the wall, the sun came up, the forest restarted. I want to talk about the years since because the night itself was one night, and a person can live through one night. But the years are different. The years are where you find out what the night did to you. The first 6 months I didn't sleep well. I'd wake up around 1 a.m. every night, like my body had set an alarm. Sometimes I'd be already sitting up in bed when I came awake, looking at the wall. I started keeping a glass of water on the nightstand because my mouth would be dry. I lost about 15 pounds without trying. My girlfriend at the time, her name was Sarah. We'd been together about 2 years, she noticed and asked what was going on. I told her I was having trouble sleeping. I didn't tell her why. We broke up about 4 months later for reasons that were not exactly about the cabin, and were not exactly not about it either. She said I had gone somewhere she couldn't follow. She wasn't wrong. I didn't argue. I helped her load her stuff into her car, and I wished her well, and I meant it. I went to a doctor in Marquette, an internist named Dr. Henderson, about the sleep. I told him the truncated version, that I'd had a bad scare at my cabin and was having trouble adjusting. He prescribed a low dose of something to help me sleep and referred me to a counselor. I took the medication for about 3 weeks. I didn't like the way it made my dreams. The dreams on the medication were a thick, gray, featureless place where I could hear things but couldn't see them. I'd rather have the bad dreams than that. I stopped the medication. I went to the counselor twice. The counselor was a woman named Linda who'd worked with veterans, and she was kind and she was good at her job. But I couldn't tell her the truth about what had happened. I gave her a version where I'd heard noises and gotten scared. She worked with that. The work was real, even if the material was thin. I went twice and then I stopped going. I felt bad about it. I think I should have kept going. I didn't. What I did instead was start reading. I read everything I could find about the area. The history of the eastern UP. The history of the Ojibwe, who were here long before any of my people. The mining and logging history, the land surveys, the early French missionaries. I wanted to find some piece of context that would make what happened to me into a footnote of a larger story, rather than a single anomalous experience. I found a lot. I found that the area where my cabin sits is part of a band of land that was specifically avoided by certain Ojibwe families for purposes I won't try to explain, because I don't have standing to explain them, and the people I would need to ask are not interested in being asked. I read an account from a Jesuit missionary in 1672 who described being told by a native guide that there were stretches of forest a man should not walk through at night, and the guide had refused to lead him through one. I read a story in a county historical society pamphlet from 1923 about a logger named Anders Björklund who walked out of his camp one evening to relieve himself and was never seen again, and his co-workers reported hearing calling from the trees afterward, and the camp was abandoned within a week. I read about a state survey crew in 1956 that had to abort a forest inventory in a section of woods about 30 miles east of my property because 2 of the surveyors quit and walked out and would not say why. None of this is proof of anything. None of this is evidence. It's the texture of a region. The UP is full of texture like this. Old stories that get repeated in bars and at funeral lunches and don't make it into books because the people who tell them don't write books. I'm not making the case that what I saw was Björklund's caller or the thing the Jesuits' guide was afraid of. I'm saying that what I saw fits into a long, quiet conversation that has been going on in this region for centuries, and that conversation is not one that the modern world has invited itself into. The modern world is barely aware the conversation is happening. I became aware of it because I sat in a cabin at 4:30 in the morning and held the wall against something that talked to me without using words. After that, the conversation became audible. I have changed in some ways that I want to mention. I am quieter than I was, my friends have commented. I sit longer in a room before I speak. I listen to the things underneath what people are saying. I notice the things people don't notice, the way a deer notices things, by attending to whatever is at the edge. I sleep with my bedroom door closed at home, in Marquette, where there is no reason at all to sleep with the door closed. I never used to. I cook in heavier amounts than I used to. I always have a few days of food in the refrigerator. I always have water. I keep a flashlight by the bed. 2 of them, actually, one for primary and one for backup. I have a small radio in my apartment that runs on batteries, and I keep batteries fresh in it, even though I have no reason to think I will ever need a battery radio in my apartment in Marquette. These are not preparations for anything specific. They are the new way I am in the world. Once you have lived through a stretch of hours where the wall between you and what you were trained to think is real becomes a thin wall, you carry the thinness with you. You make small private arrangements. The other thing is that I am better. I want to say this clearly because I don't want anyone reading this to think the story is only a dark story. I am better than I was for the first year and a half. I sleep through most nights now. I have a partner now, a woman named Kayla, who works at the public library in Marquette, and I have told her a longer version of what happened than I have ever told anyone except whoever is hearing this now. And she listened all the way through and didn't laugh and didn't get scared off and didn't ask me to prove anything. She just asked if I was okay. I said yes. She said good. That was the whole conversation. We have been together for 2.5 years. I am going to ask her to marry me in the fall. I go up to the cabin still. I have not been able to give it up. The cabin is the one piece of my dad I have left in the world that you can stand inside of. The cabin has my dad's tool marks on the rafters where he peeled the bark off the logs. The cabin has the height marks of my brother and me on the doorframe to the kitchen, pencil ticks at 4-2, 4-8, 5-1, going up the wood. The cabin has my dad's old cast iron skillet in the bottom drawer that I use to make eggs in the morning. To give up the cabin would be to give up too much. So I go. I take precautions. I sleep with the shotgun loaded and at the side of the bed. I keep the loft window latched the way my dad always did. I have installed 3 additional motion-activated lights on the exterior, 1 on each face except the door face. I have a satellite communicator now, a small one that clips to my belt, that can send a text message from anywhere with a sky view. If something happens again, I will at least be able to tell somebody. And there's one more thing, and I want to say it before I close. I think about whether they're still there. I think about the 3 at the northwest tree line and the 2 at the southeast tree line, and the way they stood in their corners for hours and watched the cabin. I think about whether they came back the next night, after I was gone, and stood in the same corners and waited. I think about whether they wait some nights still. The clearing is the same clearing. The cabin is the same cabin. The trees are the same trees, mostly give or take a few, that have come down in storms. If they are creatures of territory, my property is part of their territory. And I am an intermittent visitor to their territory who happens to also own the title to it. The title doesn't mean much to them. The title means a lot to me. We have a coexistence that is not a treaty because we never negotiated, but is something close to a tolerance. They tolerate me being there in the daytime. They tolerate me being inside the cabin at night. They have not since August 14th, 2019, tested the cabin again. I have not since then given them a reason to. What I think happened, my best guess, is that they had been waiting for the right night for a long time. The right combination of moon, weather, season, the right state of mind for the human in the cabin. They had been watching long enough to know the deer patterns, long enough to know how I slept, long enough to know which window I would look through. And on August 14th, the conditions converged, and they came, and the show was the show. And when the show ended without me coming out, they processed the data, made whatever decision they make, and moved on to the next attempt with the next person somewhere else. I might have been one of dozens of attempts they make in a year, or in a decade. Most of those attempts probably succeed, in the sense that the person walks out. The successes don't get told as stories, because the people who walked out are not available to tell them. The failures, the cabins that hold, the people who recite the multiplication tables until dawn, those are the ones who get to talk afterward. There are not many of us. I have only ever met one other, indirectly through the Pete Carjala conversation, and I never met his uncle Henry. I think there are maybe a few dozen people in the UP at any given time who have held a wall through a night like that. I think we are unconsciously quiet about it. I think we recognize each other, on the rare occasions when we cross paths, in some way that doesn't require speech. I have looked at men at gas stations in Newbury and Engadine and Manistee and known, without being able to say how I knew, that they had held a wall too. I have caught them looking back at me with the same recognition. We don't speak. We pay for our gas. We drive away. We carry it. But I think about the alternative version of the story, the one where I'm a different kind of person, or where the night is 1 degree colder, or 1 degree warmer, or where I'd had a beer too many before bed and the recitations didn't hold. I think about that version. I think about whether, in that version, I'd have walked out onto the porch in the gray light at 5:30 in the morning, and walked down the steps, and walked across the clearing, and gone with them into the tree line and never been found. There are people up here, in the UP, who go missing every year. Some of them are accounted for eventually. Hunters who get turned around. Hikers who underestimate the country. Some of them are not. They walk off and they don't come back, and nobody ever finds them, and the country is big enough and remote enough that this is just one of the things that happens. The DNR files them under unfound persons. The county sheriffs file them under cold cases. The papers run their pictures for a week or two, and then stop. I'm not saying I know what happens to them. I'm saying that I have a story to tell. about a night when I almost became one of them. And the only reason I didn't is that I happened to remember the multiplication tables and the names of the streets in my old neighborhood. And I recited them out loud in a dark cabin for an hour while something on the other side of the wall tried to convince me to come out. I still go up to the cabin. I'm going up again in 2 weeks for opening week of bow season. I'll be alone, I'll bring the shotgun, I'll bring the radio, I'll sleep with the lights off and the doors locked the way I always do. If I hear knocking at 1 in the morning, I won't go to the door. I've made that decision once. I'll make it again. I'll keep making it as many times as I have to. That's the story. That's what happened on August 14th, 2019, at a cabin 9 miles southwest of Curtis, Michigan. Take it for what it's worth. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm just telling it because I held it inside for a long time and I'm tired of holding it. Be careful out there. If you've got land and country like mine, country that's old, country that was here before we were, pay attention to the way the deer act. The deer always know first. When the deer run and don't come back, when the forest goes quiet in a way that doesn't fit the time of year, when the dogs at the neighbor's house won't go outside at night, those are signs. Don't open your door for anything that knocks at the wrong hour. Don't go outside when something is asking you to. Recite the multiplication tables in your head, if you have to. Whatever you do, hold the wall until the sun comes up. The sun always comes up. That's the one thing I learned that night that I'm sure of. The sun always comes up.